Welcome back to the Crypto Intellect, the channel where we cut through the noise and focus on what is really happening behind the headlines. Today's discussion is one that many XRP holders may not fully appreciate yet, because while most of the market remains focused on price action, there is a much bigger story developing underneath the surface. The headline says it all. They need XRP before July 14th. Most holders don't see it yet. Now, before we begin, remember that this is not financial advice. Always do your own research before making any investment decisions. What we are discussing today is infrastructure, regulation, banking modernization, and the positioning of Ripple inside a rapidly changing financial system. The reason this matters is because July 14th is not just another date on the calendar. It marks a major shift in how money moves throughout the United States. While many traders are watching candles and charts, institutions are preparing for a transformation that could impact financial infrastructure for years to come. And if you understand where Ripple fits into that transformation, you may start seeing the XRP story from a completely different perspective. The first thing investors need to understand is what happens on July 14th. On that date, the Federal Reserve's Fedwire Fund Service officially transitions to the ISO 20022 messaging standard. To many people, that sounds like a technical upgrade that belongs in a banking conference rather than a crypto discussion. But the reality is much more important. Every major financial system needs a common language. Banks, payment processors, settlement networks, and financial institutions all communicate through transaction messages. For decades, many systems have spoken different languages, requiring translations and additional layers of complexity whenever money moved between networks. ISO 20022 changes that. It creates a globally recognized messaging standard that allows financial institutions to exchange richer, more detailed, and more efficient transaction data. This is not a small software update. This is the foundation for the next generation of financial communication. When the largest payment systems begin speaking the same language, interoperability becomes dramatically easier, and that is where Ripple enters the conversation in a very significant way. One of the biggest misconceptions circulating within the crypto community is the belief that ISO 20022 automatically means XRP adoption. That is not how this works. The messaging standard itself does not require XRP. It does not force banks to buy XRP. It does not trigger an overnight price explosion. However, what it does do is remove barriers that previously made integration more difficult. Think of it like building a new highway system. The highway itself does not determine which vehicles travel on it, but it makes transportation faster, smoother, and more efficient. Ripple's infrastructure was built with this future in mind. The XRP ledger and Ripple's payment solutions were designed to function within a world where interoperability matters. As more financial systems migrate toward ISO 20022, the friction involved in connecting Ripple's technology to existing infrastructure decreases. That is not a guarantee of adoption. But it is an opportunity that becomes increasingly difficult for institutions to ignore as efficiency becomes a priority. Now, here is where things start becoming extremely interesting. While the Federal Reserve prepares for this historic transition, Ripple is simultaneously pursuing something that could fundamentally change its position in the financial system. Ripple has applied for a banking charter. Most retail investors hear that phrase and move on without understanding the implications. But obtaining a banking charter would represent one of the most important developments in the company's history. Today, Ripple interacts with certain payment systems through banking partners. That means access exists, but it exists indirectly. A successful banking charter changes that equation. Instead of depending on intermediaries, Ripple could potentially become a direct participant within critical payment infrastructure. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Direct access means greater control, reduced reliance on third parties, lower operational friction, and significantly stronger positioning within the traditional financial ecosystem. In simple terms, Ripple would move from being a company connected to the system to becoming part of the system itself. When you combine these developments together, the timing becomes impossible to ignore. On one side, the United States is modernizing its payment infrastructure through ISO 20022. On the other side, Ripple is attempting to elevate its regulatory status and deepen its integration into the financial system. These events are unfolding simultaneously. Now, that does not mean there is a secret plan or guaranteed outcome, but it does mean investors should pay close attention to the convergence of these trends. Large-scale financial transformations rarely happen overnight. They occur through a series of infrastructure upgrades, regulatory adjustments, institutional partnerships, and gradual adoption cycles. By the time the average investor notices what has happened, the groundwork has usually been laid years earlier. That is why understanding infrastructure is often more valuable than reacting to daily price fluctuations. Infrastructure determines what becomes possible. Price tends to follow later. Another aspect that deserves attention is the sheer scale of the networks involved. Fedwire processes trillions of dollars in transactions every single day. We are not talking about a niche payment platform. We are talking about one of the most important components of the U.S. financial system. At the same time, FedNow continues expanding its reach across the country, bringing instant payment capabilities to an increasing number of institutions. These systems are not replacing one another. They serve different functions. Fedwire handles large value transfers while FedNow focuses on real-time payments. Yet both are moving toward the same messaging framework. Both are embracing modernization. Both are part of a broader shift toward faster, more efficient financial operations. When viewed through that lens, Ripple's positioning becomes much easier to understand. The company has spent years building technology designed to address inefficiencies in payments, settlement, and liquidity management. As infrastructure evolves, the relevance of those solutions naturally increases. This brings us to the question many XRP holders are asking: why would institutions need XRP? The answer is more nuanced than many social media posts suggest. XRP's primary value proposition has always been efficiency in cross-border settlement and liquidity management. Traditional international transfers often involve multiple intermediaries, pre-funded accounts, and significant costs. XRP offers an alternative model where liquidity can be sourced on demand. If institutions seek ways to reduce settlement friction, free up trapped capital, and improve transaction speed, XRP becomes one potential tool available within that framework. The key word here is potential. Adoption depends on economics, regulation, business incentives, and market demand. However, as interoperability increases and integration becomes simpler, the obstacles preventing institutions from exploring these solutions become smaller. That is why many analysts focus less on short-term speculation and more on long-term infrastructure readiness. Something else that deserves attention is the changing regulatory environment. For years, regulatory uncertainty acted as a major obstacle across the digital asset industry. Companies hesitated to innovate because the rules were unclear. Institutions remained cautious because compliance risks were difficult to assess. Recently, however, the conversation has started shifting toward modernization, tokenization, and innovation frameworks. More policymakers are openly discussing the role digital assets could play in improving market efficiency. Tokenization has emerged as one of the most frequently discussed topics in financial circles. The idea is simple but powerful. Real-world assets can be represented digitally, enabling faster settlement, improved transparency, and greater accessibility. If tokenization continues gaining momentum, networks capable of supporting high-speed, low-cost transactions stand to benefit from increased attention. XRP and the XRP ledger are often included in these discussions because of their focus on settlement efficiency. What makes this story particularly fascinating is that most people are looking for a dramatic event, while the real developments are happening quietly in the background. Markets often reward patience, especially when infrastructure is involved. Consider how long it takes banks, regulators, and financial institutions to adopt new standards. These organizations move cautiously. They test systems, conduct compliance reviews, and evaluate operational risks before making major decisions. That means the most important developments frequently occur long before visible adoption appears. Investors who only focus on headlines may miss the significance of these gradual changes. Yet history repeatedly shows that infrastructure transitions create opportunities for companies positioned correctly when those transitions occur. Ripple has spent years building relationships, developing technology, and navigating regulatory challenges. Whether that effort ultimately translates into widespread adoption remains to be seen, but the positioning itself is difficult to ignore. The July 14th transition also highlights another important reality. Financial modernization is no longer a future concept. It is happening right now. Institutions are actively preparing systems, updating software, training personnel, and ensuring compliance with new standards. This is not theoretical. It is operational. Banks that fail to adapt risk being left behind. Whenever an entire industry undergoes modernization, opportunities emerge for companies capable of solving new challenges. Ripple has consistently presented itself as one of those companies. Its focus on payments, settlement, liquidity, and interoperability aligns closely with the direction many financial systems appear to be moving. Again, that does not guarantee success. But alignment matters. The closer a company's solutions match emerging industry needs, the greater the probability those solutions receive serious consideration. Another reason some analysts believe institutions may eventually require access to XRP-related infrastructure is liquidity flexibility. Liquidity is the lifeblood of financial markets. Every transaction ultimately depends on the ability to move value efficiently from one place to another. Traditional systems often lock up enormous amounts of capital in pre-funded accounts around the world. Ripple's model attempts to address that challenge through alternative liquidity mechanisms. If institutions discover they can achieve meaningful cost savings while improving transaction speed, interest naturally follows. Large organizations are constantly searching for ways to optimize operations. Even small efficiency gains can translate into significant financial benefits when transaction volumes reach billions or trillions of dollars. That is why infrastructure discussions matter. They focus on economics rather than hype. As we move closer to July 14th, investors should pay attention to developments beyond the price chart. Watch regulatory announcements, monitor progress related to Ripple's banking ambitions, observe participant growth across payment networks, follow adoption trends involving tokenization and digital settlement solutions. These indicators often provide a clearer picture of long-term direction than short-term market volatility. Price movements can be emotional and unpredictable. Infrastructure developments tend to be slower, but far more consequential. The challenge is that infrastructure stories rarely generate immediate excitement. They require patience and understanding. Yet those who take the time to follow them often gain insights unavailable to traders focused exclusively on short-term momentum. What many holders still fail to see is that the most valuable asset in finance is not money itself. It is connectivity. Systems that connect institutions, markets, and liquidity pools create enormous strategic value. ISO 2002. 2 is ultimately about connectivity. Modern payment infrastructure is about connectivity. Tokenization is about connectivity. Ripple's vision has always centered around connectivity. Whether connecting currencies, financial institutions, payment networks, or liquidity sources, the company has consistently focused on reducing friction between systems. When viewed through that perspective, recent developments appear less like isolated events and more like pieces of a larger puzzle gradually coming together over time. There is also an important psychological factor at play. Investors often underestimate gradual change because it lacks dramatic headlines. They expect a single announcement to transform everything overnight. But financial revolutions rarely happen that way. They unfold through infrastructure upgrades, policy adjustments, technological improvements, and institutional adoption curves. By the time the transformation becomes obvious, much of the value creation has already occurred. This is why experienced market participants spend so much time studying underlying trends. They know that major shifts begin beneath the surface long before they appear in mainstream narratives. The July 14th transition fits that pattern. It may not produce fireworks on day one, but it represents another step in a broader modernization journey. The phrase, "they need XRP before July 14th," should not be interpreted as a prediction of instant adoption or immediate price action. Instead, it reflects a deeper argument about preparation. Institutions preparing for the future need infrastructure that can operate efficiently within modernized financial systems. They need interoperability. They need liquidity solutions. They need settlement efficiency. They need technology capable of functioning in an increasingly connected global environment. XRP exists within that conversation because it was designed to address many of those challenges. Whether institutions ultimately choose to leverage XRP directly will depend on numerous factors. But the problems XRP was created to solve are becoming more visible as financial modernization accelerates. When all the pieces are placed together, a clearer picture emerges. The United States is upgrading payment infrastructure. Global systems are converging around common standards. Regulatory discussions are increasingly focused on innovation and tokenization. Ripple is pursuing deeper integration within the financial ecosystem. And the XRP ledger continues evolving as a platform for settlement and asset movement. None of these developments alone guarantees anything. Yet collectively they describe a financial landscape moving steadily toward greater efficiency, interoperability, and digitization. That is the story many investors overlook because they are waiting for immediate results instead of watching the foundations being built underneath them. As we wrap up today's discussion, remember this: July 14th is not necessarily important because of what happens that day. It is important because of what it represents. It represents the continued modernization of financial infrastructure. It represents the removal of barriers between systems. It represents a future where settlement becomes faster, data becomes richer, and interoperability becomes standard. Ripple has spent years positioning itself for that future. XRP has spent years existing within that ecosystem. The question is not whether a switch flips on July 14th. The real question is how many institutions will eventually recognize the value of infrastructure that was designed for the world being built right now. Most holders are still watching the price. The biggest players may be watching the plumbing, and history has shown that the plumbing often matters first.